Perhaps you've heard the story of Uzzah, and the main conclusion that you come to in that story is God doesn't play. And because he touched that ark, God struck him dead. And is a reverence and a fear that we should have of the Lord. I think that's a good lesson to learn from Uzzah. And today we're going to read through 2 Samuel, the first 15 or so verses of chapter 6, and talk about the story of Uzzah and talk about that lesson that people most often get, which is God doesn't play. It's a good lesson to have. What we're going to do in the next video, though, in the part 2 of this, is we're actually going to take a look at other passages that are relevant and that give us a greater context to the Uzzah story. And I think we're going to come to a couple of new conclusions that perhaps you haven't seen before. But today is just part 1. We're just going to look at the story of Uzzah just in 2 Samuel 6. We're going to confine ourselves to that. That's going to be hard to do, but that's what we're going to do. We're just going to be in 2 Samuel chapter 6, and we're going to draw that main conclusion that many people get from the story, which is that we should fear God, we should obey God, and when we don't, there are consequences. So let's take a look at 2 Samuel chapter 6. In 2 Samuel 6, David is the king of Israel. And at this point, the Ark of the Covenant has not been in the place that the king wanted it, which is a place that he has begun to square away and to designate where the ark would be. He is beginning to think about how he would like to build a temple for God. And we know later on that he's not going to be able to do this, that his son Solomon is going to be the one that builds the temple. But David has a heart for God. He has a heart for the Lord, and he wants the Ark of the Covenant to not be in some back room in somebody's house, which is basically where it is right now. But here in 2 Samuel chapter 6, beginning with verse 2, the scripture says, "And David arose and went with all the people who were with him from Baal of Judah to bring up from there the ark of God, whose name is called by the name, the Lord of hosts, who dwells between the cherubim. So they set the ark of God on a new cart and brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. And Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, drove the new cart. And they brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill, accompanying the ark of God. And Ahio went before the ark. Then David and all the house of Israel played music before the Lord on all kinds of instruments, of fir wood, on harps, on stringed instruments, on tambourines, on sistrums, and on cymbals." So far, so good. The ark of God is coming to the place that David has set aside for it, and they're bringing it out of this back room, basically, of this house of a man named Abinadab, and his 2 sons are driving the cart, and they are taking this ark, and they're playing all of these instruments. They are celebrating because the ark of God, where God is said to dwell between the cherubim. Now again, because we're staying just here in 2 Samuel 6, we're not going to talk about the context of that and where we learn that the presence of God would come between the cherubim. We're going to look at that in the next video. But in this video, we just want to simply point out everything looks good. People are celebrating. People are happy to see the ark of God come back to its rightful place. And David wants it to go to the city of David. It's been bouncing all around. At least it's not in the hands of the Philistines anymore, which again, we'll look at that context in the next video. But here, it's coming back to where it should be. And the scripture says in verse 6, "And when they came to Nachon's threshing floor, Uzzah put out his hand to the ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen stumbled. Then the anger of the Lord was aroused against Uzzah, and God struck him there for his error, and he died there by the ark of God. And David became angry because of the Lord's outbreak against Uzzah, and he called the name of the place Perez Uzzah to this day." Everything was going great. They're playing these instruments. They are happy because the ark of God is going to go to its rightful place. And the scripture says here that the oxen stumbled, and Uzzah appears to put out his hand to stabilize the ark. There are some people that look at this passage and they say, well, the ark was falling off and he was just grabbing it to make sure it didn't fall off. He didn't want it to go down in the dirt and all of that. It doesn't really say that. What it says is that he put out his hand and took hold of the ark because the oxen stumbled, or for the oxen stumbled. So if you imagine, again, it's on a cart, the oxen stumbled, Uzzah is back there with the ark, you would think, or maybe he's sitting in front of it, and when the oxen stumble, he puts his hand back and takes hold of it to stabilize it. It doesn't say he caught it. It doesn't say that he grabbed it because it was about to fall off. It just doesn't say that. So we don't want to read too much into what the scripture says. What it sounds like is he's trying to make sure it doesn't fall off. and he is doing more of a proactive measure than he is a reactive measure to make sure it doesn't fall. It seems that he's doing this to make sure it doesn't go to a place where it could possibly fall. Now, even that is not, it's not that clear from the text, but that's closer to what we can reasonably say about what's happening here than to say it was falling, because it does not say that. It says that the oxen stumbled, but it doesn't say that the ark was falling. When Uzzah took hold of that ark, God struck him dead right there because of his error. And it says here that David became angry. Now, it does not say he was angry at God. He was angry because of God's outbreak against Uzzah. But if I were to guess, from what we know about David, he's a man after God's own heart. I think his anger probably had to do with he had all these preparations. He had all these plans to take the ark and put it in its rightful place. And clearly, we're not doing that now. Somebody just died right here. So you have someone that just died. God struck him dead. Everything's on hold. And so the scripture says next in verse 9, David was afraid of the Lord that day. And he said, how can the ark of the Lord come to me? So David would not move the ark of the Lord with him into the city of David, but David took it aside into the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite. The ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite, 3 months. And the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and all his household. Now this is a curious thing. David is afraid because somebody just got struck dead when they were trying to take the ark of God back. And so David says, well, let's let it stay basically in the same area where it is. There's this man named Obed-Edom, a Gittite. That's referring to someone from Gath. So potentially this man is not even an Israelite, but maybe he's associated with the Israelites somehow. But David allows it to go into that place. And God blesses the house of this man. Now that's a very interesting thing, that the ark gets placed there, and God blesses the house of this man who may not have been an Israelite during this time. It is at this point that the scripture says, verse 12, now it was told King David, saying, the Lord has blessed the house of Obed-Edom and all that belongs to him because of the ark of God. So David went and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with gladness. And so it was, when those bearing the ark of the Lord had gone 6 paces, that he sacrificed oxen and fatted sheep. Then David danced before the Lord with all his might, and David was wearing a linen ephod. So David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting and with the sound of the trumpet. Now it goes on to say later on in this chapter, it talks about how Michal, David's wife, the daughter of Saul, despises him because of this. Now, again, we're not going to turn to any other passages, but David has taken on other wives by this time. And so I think there's a lot going on with her, with Michal. I don't think she's just simply against the ark of God coming into Israel. I think she does have some perspective as a king's daughter in terms of how David is acting. That's part of it. But I think there's probably some irritation with her that David has all these wives and has all these kids by all these different wives. And it says by the end of the chapter, sadly, that David has no children by Michal, and apparently he does not go in to have relations with her probably until the day of her death. So that never happens, which is really a sad end to the story of again, we're not going to go to any other passages here today, but when you think about how Jonathan and David were such good friends, how Michal loved David deeply, and how there really could have been a peaceful transfer of power from Saul to David, and that Jonathan could have been David's right-hand man, his commander. Michal would have been married to David. They would have had a bunch of kids. There's an alternate reality where things go a lot differently for Michal and for Jonathan, and even for Saul himself, if Saul had tried to obey God instead of doing what he did. And so it's sad to see this with Michal. But our point here today is to think about Uzzah and the lesson that people generally get when they read this. If you're just reading 2 Samuel 6 and you read nothing else, and it's really hard for me right now to not read anything else, because that's what just gives us so much illumination into the scripture, is to let other scripture help us to understand things. But today we're just going to look at 2 Samuel 6. If all you do is read 2 Samuel chapter 6, what you see is David brings the ark of God out of the house of this man named Abinadab. His 2 sons are helping out. They've got they've got the ark of God on a cart pulled by oxen. The oxen stumble. Uzzah puts out his hand and grabs hold of the ark. probably to stabilize it, and God strikes him dead. David then, in fear, and there's some anger there, leaves the ark in that area. It's taken into the house of a man named Obed-Edom, and God blesses the house of this man. And so when David comes back later, he then takes the ark back to the city of David as he had planned. But there's a lot that's missing here. But if this is all that we had, one of the lessons, and I think the main lesson that people generally get from this, is God doesn't play. If God tells you to do things a certain way, then he wants them done that way. And I think at the very least, even if we read no other passage but 2 Samuel 6, we can at the very least know that no one was supposed to touch that ark. You were not supposed to grab hold of it the way Uzzah did. And because he did, God's anger arose against him and God struck him dead. And so when we think about ourselves, there should be a proper fear and a proper reverence for God when we are dealing with him. And that if we do not deal with him properly, he has every right to strike us and to punish us in a way that might seem harsh to us. But we need to understand that the fear and reverence of God are what God's people should do and what they should be. And there are consequences when you do not revere him in that way. Now, that's all we're going to do with today's video. This is part one. We've looked at the basic story of Uzzah just from 2 Samuel chapter 6. We have not gone to any other passages. We've just looked at 2 Samuel chapter 6. And there's a real lesson there. What I want to show you is the power of context in the next video. In the next video, we are going to look at passages that really give us additional light here, that really explain some things that you can't get just from reading 2 Samuel 6. About the background leading up to this, and about what happens in between David leaving the ark there in the home of Obed-Edom and when he brings it back to the city of David. What happens in between there? Because there's some things that we are not told in this account that when we go over to 1 Chronicles, we're going to see. And so those two aspects are going to give us two, I believe, additional lessons about the story of Uzzah that are actually very powerful and applicable to us today. I don't think we should be fearful that God is going to strike us dead if we do the wrong thing in terms of fear and reverence. It is true, though, that there are real consequences that come to God's people if we do not fear and reverence God properly. But I think it's these other two lessons that we're going to see from the context that maybe you haven't seen before that I think have been very helpful for me when I think about the story of Uzzah. That's it for today's video. Again, watch out for part 2 of the Uzzah story because we are going to be looking at a bunch of passages that are not 2 Samuel chapter 6. And there are going to be two major lessons that we're going to get from this. If this video was helpful to you, like the video, share it, and subscribe to this channel for more simple Bible teaching that applies to our everyday lives.